Today I'll show you how to paint Crimson Fists to a high quality for a low cost in time and effort. This is the first in a series of videos where I speed paint the classic Space Marine chapters using a small number of paints. First basing and highlighting in acrylics, doing some magic with a transparent oil wash, then using a cheap and efficient basing method. In the lore, Space Marine armour is made of ceramite. The name suggests both ceramic and metal, so we can paint it with a rough matte surface like a flower pot. This would be a fast way of painting. Or we can paint it with a shiny glossy surface like metal, which would give it a lot of visual interest. Crimson Fists are blue with a red pot colour, so we can find a place for both methods. And we'll keep it interesting by moving highlights and shadows around the colour wheel, not just getting lighter and darker. So if you're ready for some fist fun, keep on watching. The model is sprayed all over with Molotov's tulip blue metal. This acts as a primer and a base coat in one. This colour has a very slight purple hue, which sets up the final colour. It seems too bright at this point, but once the oils are on, they'll tone everything down. Brush paint the connectors between the armour sections with a grey. Then paint the top of the gun and the lower half of the backpack in black. What if you make a mistake? Well, have a spare brush by your water cup, and as soon as you notice it, flood the mistake in water. This stops it from drying and setting. Then use a Q-tip and some cleaning alcohol to sponge it up. Be very careful and just go slowly so you don't pull up any of the existing paint. Now put on the first of the highlights. With a blue-green, start by painting the upward facing surfaces around the head. This focuses attention on the head. Then edge highlighting mostly the edges that are upward facing and would catch the light. Focus on areas that you want people to pay attention to. So the head, chest, arms and the top front of the backpack, but also a few edges that poke out particularly far, like the knee guards, hip plates and the back of the ankle. For speed painting, I think it's a good idea to give yourself a time limit for edge highlighting, say 3 or 4 minutes per model. That forces you to pay attention to the edges that add the most to the model. Now for the dry brush. This pushes those edge highlights even further and gives the model a rough terracotta look. I'm using Vallejo's light green blue and only brushing the model from the top down. This hits the model the way that the light would catch it. And the reason we painted the black so early is so that it gets some of this dry brush highlighting and integrates it into the general colour scheme of the model. I quickly paint the leather in a light brown, and then it's on to the red. I'd highly recommend using Citadel's Mephiston red. It's got great coverage after the classic 2 thin coats, which is far better than any red that Vallejo has to offer. Crimson Fists normally have just the left hand in red, but looking at a bit of the art, it seems the higher ranks tend to have both hands in red, and Marine Sergeants have a red helmet. Also paint the wax of the purity seals with this. Now we mix a medium highlight for the red. The old dilemma with highlighting red is whether to highlight towards white and end up with something that looks pink, or to highlight towards yellow and end up with something that looks orange. The answer is a colour like Vallejo's Sunny Skin Tone, which is a mixture of the two. To create a contrast of texture between the red and the blue, we highlight the red as if it's a shiny surface with reflected lights rather than true highlights. Reflections run lengthways down cylinders, and on the Power Fist I've put a big one running down the front, spilling out onto the flat surfaces of the fingers, which is similar to the angle of the bright parts. Then there's a smaller reflection running down the back of the fist. The hand of this Marine is particularly large, but on a regular trooper it would be painted the same way, just smaller. If this were a display quality miniature, it might be worth planning out the lights and the colours in the environment surrounding the Marine and how they'd interact with the armour. But since it's just a speed paint, we'll just replicate the visual tells of a reflection and place them on the parts of the armour where they'll be the most aesthetically pleasing. On a sphere, reflections form around a single point, and on the helmet I put that point facing forwards. I do a layer with the mixed highlight colour and then thin it out into a glaze and smooth the transition. For the brightest parts I use a pure sunny skin tone and again glaze the edges. Then I edge highlight any upward or sideward facing edges that the brush can get to easily. A lot of Space Marine models are carrying skulls around, so I stuck one to the base to show you how to paint it. The skull and the parchment of the purity seal are painted with the same bone colour. Then on the skull, the teeth are painted in white and the face is edge highlighted in white. On the purity seal, the top edge where the sheets of parchment overlap is also highlighted with white as a way to separate the sheets. I didn't have any transfers for these guys, so I freehanded the designs. If you're doing an army of Crimson Fists, I'd recommend trying to track down the old Space Marine transfer sheets. On the purity seal you could paint on some scratchy lines with a black and brown mix, then spray on a matte varnish and we can move on to the metallics. Metallics should be applied on top of the varnish. Varnish over top of them would destroy their finish, and with the mica chips embedded in them, they're pretty tough and they don't require any additional protection. I paint the gun in the functional metal, including the ribbed cables, with a dark metal colour, and then I paint the decorative trim in silver. The main oil paint used here is an alizarin crimson. This is a transparent red with a slight purple hue, darkened with a touch of phthalo green, a transparent blue-green. The mix is about 10 to 1, but you know it's right when you get the properties you can see here, where the mass tone, that's the thick parts, is very dark, almost black, and the undertone, where it's thin, retains the intense crimson. The second colour is a chromatic black. Take a piece of the original mix and add even more phthalo green until the mix becomes very dark and the undertone becomes a smoky violet. If you want to paint a whole army with these methods, I'd recommend mixing large quantities to start with and keeping them in airtight jars. That will save time with each painting session and it will maintain consistency of colour throughout the army. I mix the colours with an odourless solvent using just enough that the lumps of paint can be broken up and dissolve easily. This will be around the consistency of a contrast paint. This time I added a little bit of liquid. This will dramatically speed up the dry time, but you will have to be mindful of performing the cleaning step very soon after the solvent has evaporated. It can also give the oils an ultra glossy finish and force you to brush paint and matte varnish over the non-metalled sections. For large batches, I really don't think this would be worth the hassle. Starting with the hardest to reach details, paint any grey, black or metal parts of the model with the black mix, and any red or blue parts with the red mix. Oils destroy paintbrushes, so use an expendable synthetic one. The bone, parchment and leather parts are painted with an opaque dark brown. This is thinned in the same way as the other oils. For this I'd recommend using the lowest quality paint you can get your hands on. Poorly ground pigments combined with the opacity will give it a rough and grainy finish, like it's been through the wars. When picking a paint for this, be mindful that opaques don't darken towards their mass tone, so it does need to be a fairly dark colour to start with. Leave the model in a warm, well ventilated place, and once all the thinner has evaporated, we can clean the model with Q-tips. Start with a dry Q-tip for the most control, removing oil paint from all the raised areas that would get the most light. This creates highlights by exposing the lighter colours of the acrylics under the oils. The raised and cleaned areas will be stained by the undertone and shifted towards a more violet hue, while the recesses will have a thick enough coverage that they become the mass tone. This gives you panel lining with no extra effort. Once the dry Q-tip is no longer removing much paint, you can moisten a fresh one in water and clean a more focused area of highlights. The water won't react chemically with the oil paint, but moist cotton will be more effective at wiping. And finally, we can use a Q-tip dampened with thinner and focus this on the highlights we deliberately painted on. This 3-stage cleaning gives us a smooth transition from the darkest to the lightest parts. A few precautions: throw away the Q-tips as soon as they start to fray so they don't shed on the model. And don't move a Q-tip from the brown to the rest of the model. You don't want to smudge that nasty paint across the rest of it. The basing mix is a combination of wall filler and PVA glue, then coloured with a red and brown mix. I think models look best when the ground colour is similar to the colour of the shadows that are cast across their bodies. I've used craft paints to colour it, but pigment powders, ground pastels or inks would be better. Then I add some model railway gravel to add texture, and again if you want to do a full army, mix it all in an airtight jar. Shovel the basing mix onto the base, spread it around with a toothpick, and then with an old wet brush, wipe off the base rim and smooth off the surface. You can also water down some of this mix and spread it across the model's feet so it looks like it's a part of the environment. Wild grasses can look great on a model's base, but the stock tufts don't look like any grass I've ever seen. They're perfect circles where all the blades are an identical length, and then they're a gloss plastic when the rest of the model is painted. I fix the shape with nail scissors, first quartering the tuft and removing any sharp corners, then shortening the blades near the edges to give it a cone shape. To attach the tuft, dip it in PVA and push it into the basing mix while that's still wet. Then to keep them solid and to give them a shade, mix dark brown and PVA, water it down and soak it into the base of the tuft, locking together the lower half while letting the top stay independent. And blend any blobs of PVA into the base mix, otherwise they'll dry glossy. Once the oil paint and the basing mix are dry and no longer feel sticky to the touch, and this may take several days, we can go on to the final acrylic touches. First, base the eyes in red, being careful to preserve the dark ring around the edge left by the oil wash. We want to make this red different to the red of the fist, and we do this by mixing the highlight and the shade with different paints. Make a mix of red and black and a mix of red and white. Imagine a direction for the light that's shining at the eyes. Since this model has a glossy helmet, I use the direction of light suggested by the shiny spots. Now shade the lens with the red and white mix, and highlight with the red and black. This imitates light bouncing off the concave inside surface of the lens and being flipped around. Then we can dot some of the pure white between the mid and the dark tones, and this suggests light bouncing off the outside surface. Use the red and white to highlight the raised parts of the Purity Seal wax. Since the wax is quite glossy, we can use some of the pure white to highlight two opposite points, suggesting a shiny line running across the surface. With more of the white, we can add some very bright highlights to the red parts of the armour. Hold the model steady and apply a tiny bit of thin white to some of the parts painted with the pure sunny skin tone, particularly any T-shapes where the shine lines meet the edge highlights, but add a few extra dots to the rest of the shine lines and to the most raised edges. Then dry brush the base mix, vegetation and any objects in the dirt with a bone colour. And paint the base rim and we're done. I repeated the methods on a basic marine with just the one normal sized red hand and not including drying time or mixing, which you do only once per batch or once per army. The model took an hour and a quarter to paint. But with a little more practice, and if I was painting in batches, I'm confident I could bring the average time per model under an hour, and I'm not a particularly fast painter. If you wanted to speed it up even further, you could skip the manual highlighting on the blue and give the red a rough texture with a dry brush. Either way, I hope I've helped you give your hobby friends a real nice fisting.